The children's hospital corridor stretched endlessly under flickering fluorescent lights, each buzz a metronome counting seconds that felt like hours. Peyton Navarro stood motionless outside the surgical wing, his expensive coat incongruous against sterile white walls, hands buried deep in pockets to prevent them from forming fists. At 3:17 in the morning, the hallway belonged to ghosts and insomniacs, to families clinging to hope through sheer stubborn refusal to sleep. A nurse passed without meeting his gaze, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against linoleum in rhythmic intervals that measured distance rather than time. His niece had been in surgery for 6 hours, a routine procedure transformed into crisis when complications bloomed like dark flowers in her chest cavity. The surgeon's carefully neutral expression, before disappearing behind double doors, had communicated more than any words could. The sound reached him before the vision did, bare feet padding against cold floor with determined purpose rather than aimless wandering. A small figure emerged from the shadowed alcove near the nursing station, dragging a thin hospital blanket that trailed behind like ceremonial robes. The boy moved with peculiar confidence for someone so young, as though the darkness held no mysteries he hadn't already catalogued. Peyton registered details automatically. Approximately 7 years old, oversized pajamas suggesting hand-me-downs or rapid growth, hair that needed cutting falling into eyes that tracked movement with predatory awareness. The hospital's heating system hummed through overhead vents, pushing stale air that carried antiseptic undertones mixed with something sweeter. The artificial fragrance meant to mask illness, but only emphasized it. Peyton had stopped noticing these details years ago, trained himself to filter environmental noise until only threats registered. But the boy's appearance had sharpened his awareness, made him catalog everything with fresh intensity. A phone rang somewhere down the corridor, shrill intrusion that went unanswered for 7 rings before someone finally silenced it. The sound emphasized the emptiness of this wing during graveyard hours. The skeleton crew stretched thin across too many floors. Peyton wondered how often Emmett wandered these halls, how many nurses recognized him as regular fixture rather than concerning anomaly. The boy's shoes, or lack thereof, bothered Peyton more than it should have. Hospital floors weren't just cold, but collected everything, germs and fluids that no amount of cleaning could fully eliminate. That Emmett navigated them barefoot spoke to either remarkable constitution or dangerous exposure that would eventually catch up with him. Peyton's phone buzzed in his pocket, undoubtedly update about his niece's surgery, but he didn't reach for it. Something about this moment felt suspended, important, in a way he couldn't articulate, as though responding to the notification would shatter fragile connection forming between him and this strange child who approached monsters without flinching. The child stopped directly in front of him without hesitation, without the usual wariness children exhibited when confronting strange adults in empty corridors. This boy had learned different lessons about danger. "My mom says you kill monsters," the child announced, his voice carrying clearly despite its small size, each word enunciated with careful precision. There was no question in the statement, no tremor of fear or excitement, simply presentation of fact requiring acknowledgement. Peyton felt something cold settle beneath his ribs, recognition of truth delivered through innocent mouth. The boy tilted his head slightly, studying Peyton's face with intensity that belonged in interrogation rooms rather than pediatric wards. His fingers clutched the blanket with white-knuckled grip that contradicted his steady gaze, the only visible indicator of vulnerability beneath practiced composure. Peyton saw himself at that age, saw every child who learned too early that monsters wore human faces. The ICU door beside them remained closed, its small window revealing nothing but darkness punctuated by blinking machinery lights. Peyton's eyes slid away from the boy's unwavering stare, found refuge in studying that impenetrable barrier between corridor and crisis. His jaw tightened imperceptibly, muscle memory of suppressing reactions that could be interpreted as weakness. The hospital's recycled air suddenly felt insufficient, each breath requiring conscious effort. "Sometimes," Peyton heard himself say, the word emerging rougher than intended, scraped raw from somewhere beneath his carefully maintained exterior. He had built an empire on decisive action, on eliminating threats with surgical precision, yet this child's simple declaration stripped away years of calculated distance. The boy nodded once, satisfied with an answer that would have horrified most adults, then reached into his pajama pocket with deliberate slowness. He produced a folded piece of paper, edges soft from repeated handling, and extended it toward Peyton without looking away. Peyton accepted it automatically, his fingers noting the warmth transferred from small hand to his own cold skin. The drawing revealed itself in simple crayon strokes, a figure with dark hair standing between a woman and child, arms spread wide against scribbled darkness. Above the protective figure, the boy had written in uneven letters, "Monster Killer." The crayon had pressed hard enough to leave impressions on the reverse side, evidence of conviction in every stroke. "I'm Emmett," the child said, still watching Peyton's face for reactions he had clearly learned to interpret long before he should have needed such skills. His bare feet shifted slightly on cold floor, toes curling against temperature that must have been uncomfortable, but went unacknowledged. Before Peyton could formulate response, hurried footsteps echoed from the nursing station direction, accompanied by breathless apology already forming on approaching lips. A woman rounded the corner with controlled urgency, her scrubs bearing the hospital's radiology department insignia, dark hair escaping from hasty ponytail. Exhaustion had carved itself into her features, but her eyes, the same shade as her son's, held fierce protectiveness that transformed fatigue into determination. She reached for Emmett's shoulder with practiced gentleness, checking him for injury or distress in single sweeping glance before her attention shifted to Peyton. "I'm so sorry if he bothered you," she said, her voice pitched low to avoid disturbing sleeping patients, but carrying unmistakable authority nonetheless. Her hand rested protectively on Emmett's head, fingers threading through hair that needed maternal attention. Recognition flickered across her face, not of his identity, but of his type. Expensive clothes, dangerous stillness, the particular quality of power that radiated from men accustomed to obedience. Her other hand remained visible at her side, empty, but positioned with unconscious readiness, the stance of someone who had learned to anticipate sudden violence. Peyton noticed her scrubs bore small stain near the hem, dark spot that could have been coffee or blood, impossible to distinguish under fluorescent lighting. Her identification badge hung crooked on its lanyard, photos showing version of her that looked younger, less worn, taken perhaps when she'd first started working here before circumstances had carved away her optimism. The way she positioned herself between Emmett and Peyton wasn't obvious, subtle shift of weight that placed her son fractionally behind her protective radius. The movement was instinctive, practiced through repetition, until it became automatic response to any adult male in proximity. Peyton recognized the defensive choreography, had seen it countless times in people who'd learned that danger wore familiar faces. Her wedding ring finger bore pale band of skin, ghost of jewelry removed but not long enough ago for tan line to fade completely. Peyton filed this detail away with others, constructing narrative from evidence. Single mother, divorced or widowed, struggling with finances if the worn shoes and faded scrubs were indicators. The bruise on her jaw told different story though, one that rarely involved ex-spouses who'd moved on. A doctor emerged from patient room down the hall, white coat billowing behind him as he moved with purposeful stride toward nursing station. Sable's body tensed at his appearance, not looking directly at him, but tracking his movement through peripheral vision until he'd passed beyond threatening proximity. Only then did her shoulders drop incrementally, breath releasing in silent exhalation of relief. Peyton noticed the purple shadow beneath her jaw's edge, nearly concealed by carefully applied makeup that had faded during her shift. The bruise was perhaps 3 days old, transitioning from deep violet to sickly yellow at its periphery. "He wasn't bothering me," Peyton replied, his tone carefully neutral, professional courtesy masking the recognition that coiled in his chest. He had seen that particular shade of injury too many times, knew exactly the force required to produce such discoloration on throat's vulnerable side. Sable Walsh, her name tag identified her, guided Emmett back a step, creating distance that felt both protective and apologetic. Her badge also revealed she worked in radiology, night shift designation printed beneath department information. "Come on, sweetheart. You know you're supposed to stay where I can see you," she murmured to Emmett, exhaustion bleeding through her attempt at gentle reprimand. The boy leaned into her side without resistance, though his eyes never left Peyton's face. Peyton folded the drawing carefully, his movements deliberate and slow so as not to alarm them. He slipped it into his coat's inner pocket, the gesture somehow feeling like acceptance of contract he hadn't consciously agreed to. "He has good instincts," Peyton said, directing the comment to Sable but maintaining eye contact with Emmett. The double meaning hung in antiseptic air between them, acknowledgement of the boy's accuracy and assessment. Sable's expression shifted minutely, confusion giving way to wariness as she processed his words. Her fingers tightened on Emmett's shoulder, not pulling him closer but preparing to move him if necessary. "We should let you get back to your weight," she said, Politeness stretched thin over desire to remove her son from this interaction. She glanced toward the surgical wing, piecing together why someone like Peyton would be haunting these corridors at impossible hours. Emmett opened his mouth as though to protest, but Sable's hand moved to cup his cheek with such tenderness that whatever argument he'd prepared dissolved unspoken. The gesture revealed another bruise on her wrist, ring-shaped and distinct, the kind left by fingers that had gripped with intent to control rather than support. "Mom works until 7, Emmett informed Peyton with same matter-of-fact tone he'd used for his earlier declaration. The statement carried layers of meaning, explanation for his presence, justification for his wandering, perhaps invitation masked as simple fact. Sable's face colored slightly at her son's revelation, embarrassment at having their circumstances exposed to stranger mixing with resigned acceptance that Emmett had never learned proper boundaries between private and public information. Children who grew up in war zones didn't understand peacetime protocols. "The radiology department is short-staffed," she explained unnecessarily, defensive instinct triggered by judgment she anticipated, but Peyton hadn't expressed. Her free hand moved to adjust her ponytail, nervous gesture that drew attention to tremor in her fingers. Peyton noted the coffee stains on her scrubs, the worn soles of shoes designed for 12-hour shifts stretched to 16. He recognized the particular exhaustion of someone working multiple jobs, the hollow-eyed determination of parent with no safety net beneath their tightrope walk. "He can wait in the family room," Sable continued, though her tone suggested this was established pattern rather than special arrangement. "There's a volunteer who checks on kids throughout the night, makes sure they're safe." The word safe landed with ironic weight, given the bruises that told stories of home where safety was negotiable concept at best. Emmett's earlier assessment of Peyton as monster killer suddenly acquired additional dimensions. The boy was conducting reconnaissance, identifying potential allies in war he shouldn't have to fight. A code blue announcement crackled through overhead speakers, sending Sable's body rigid with professional alertness, even though the emergency was 3 floors away. Her breathing quickened momentarily before training reasserted control, but Peyton had witnessed the spike of anxiety that accompanied medical crises when you carried too many of your own. Emmett tugged his mother's hand, redirecting her attention with practiced ease of child accustomed to managing adult emotions. He whispered something Peyton couldn't hear, words meant only for Sable's ears. She bent down to his level, forehead touching his briefly in gesture of connection that spoke volumes about their relationship. Whatever he said made her smile despite exhaustion, made some tension drain from shoulders that carried too much weight. When she straightened, her expression had shifted toward something approaching warmth, though wariness remained embedded beneath surface courtesy. She met Peyton's eyes directly for first time, searching for something she couldn't quite name. "Thank you for being kind to him," she said simply, the words carrying more significance than their surface meaning suggested. In her world, adult men who didn't dismiss or threaten her son were apparently rare enough to warrant gratitude. Peyton inclined his head slightly, accepting her thanks without verbal response. He understood that some acknowledgments required no elaboration, that sometimes presence alone communicated more than language could contain. Sable guided Emmett back toward the nursing station, but the boy glanced over his shoulder twice, checking to ensure Peyton remained where they'd left him. The second look held question, or perhaps promise, of future encounter. Peyton returned his attention to the surgical wing doors, to the waiting that had briefly been interrupted by small boy with dangerous perception. But something had shifted in the quality of his vigil, purpose crystallizing around edges of concern that had been formless before. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts until he found the name he needed. 3 rings before answer. Voice on other end alert, despite hour suggesting its owner never truly slept. "I need information on someone," Peyton said without preamble, his tone conveying urgency that required no explanation to man who had served him for 15 years. He provided Sable Walsh's name, her department, the shift she worked. The person on phone's end asked no questions, requested no justification. In Peyton's world, curiosity was luxury reserved for those without bills to pay, and loyalty was currency more valuable than discretion. Peyton ended the call and pocketed his phone, eyes returning to ICU door that still revealed nothing. But now his mind was divided between niece fighting for life behind sterile barriers and boy who had looked at him and seen exactly what he was, then asked for help anyway. The drawing in his pocket felt heavier than paper should, weighted with implications he wasn't yet ready to fully examine. Emmett had identified him as monster killer, but the question remained whether the boy understood that monsters came in multiple varieties, that sometimes the hunter and hunted shared the same face. A door opened down the corridor, spilling light and hurried medical personnel into hallway that had been still moments before. Peyton's body tensed with anticipation, but the activity was for different families' crisis, different child's emergency. He forced himself to breathe through the false alarm, to resettle into waiting that might stretch hours more. But part of his attention remained on radiology department somewhere in this building's depths, on woman working through night while her son mapped hospital corridors like territories requiring surveillance. The surgical waiting room's coffee machine gurgled through another cycle, producing liquid that barely qualified as beverage, but provided ritualistic comfort to people marking time through crisis. Peyton had consumed 4 cups, not tasting any of them. Fuel for sustained alertness rather than pleasure. The caffeine buzzed through his system without producing the clarity he sought, just heightened the sense that something fundamental had shifted during his encounter with Emmett. His reflection in darkened window across from his chair showed man who looked older than 30, stress and occupation having added years that didn't correspond to calendar time. The expensive clothes and controlled posture couldn't fully mask what he was, though most people were too polite or frightened to acknowledge what they saw. But Emmett had looked directly at it, had named it without flinching, and in doing so had somehow made it less monstrous. A janitor worked his way down the corridor, mopping with methodical efficiency that suggested he'd walked this same route thousands of times. He nodded at Peyton in acknowledgement of shared night-dwelling status, one insomniac recognizing another. The man's radio played softly, classical music incongruous against institutional setting, Mozart or Beethoven transformed into cleaning soundtrack. Peyton pulled out the drawing again, unfolding it carefully to study Emmett's artistic representation of protection. The crayon figure bearing his approximate proportions stood with arms outstretched, barrier between darkness and the vulnerable. The simplicity of the image belied its emotional complexity, child's understanding of good and evil rendered in primary colors that allowed no room for the shades of gray Peyton inhabited. Emmett had counted something when they spoke. Peyton had noticed the boy's fingers tapping against his leg in rhythm that suggested calculation, rather than nervous energy. The child was tracking patterns, building mental maps of movement and timing. It was exactly what Peyton had done at that age, when home was place requiring constant vigilance and survival, depended on predicting adult behavior before it crystallized into action. The recognition sat uncomfortable in his chest, memory of boy he'd been colliding with man he'd become. His phone buzzed with incoming message, preliminary information arriving with efficiency that justified the premium Peyton paid for such services. Sable Walsh, 29, employed at 3 different healthcare facilities across Minneapolis, single mother with no record of government assistance despite income that barely cleared poverty line. The next detail made his jaw tighten. She shared apartment lease with Colin Walsh, brother, whose record included multiple arrests for drunk and disorderly conduct. One domestic violence charge that had been dropped when the complainant, his ex-girlfriend, had suddenly become unavailable to testify. Peyton didn't need forensic analysis to understand the narrative those facts constructed. He had witnessed enough variations of the same story to recognize its architecture, the way violence found cracks in systems designed to prevent it, and nested there like parasites in host bodies. 2 nights later, Peyton found himself walking the same corridor, though his niece had been transferred to recovery and no longer required his vigil. The excuse he'd constructed, checking on her progress, felt transparent even to himself, but he'd stopped questioning the impulse that drew him back to antiseptic hallways and flickering lights. The radiology department occupied the basement level, accessible through service elevator that hospital visitors rarely used. Peyton had memorized the route from blueprints he'd acquired through channels that didn't require explanation, the kind of thoroughness that had kept him alive in business where carelessness was terminal condition. He positioned himself near the vending machines across from the department's entrance, far enough to avoid suspicion, but close enough to observe. At 2:47, Sable emerged carrying stack of imaging films, her movements efficient despite exhaustion that radiated from her frame like heat from overworked engine. She moved to the reading room visible through interior windows, settling at lightbox with posture that suggested this was her 100th film of the night, rather than her 10th. The blue-white glow illuminated her face from below, casting shadows that aged her beyond her years. Peyton watched her work with focus that excluded everything beyond the images before her, professional competence evident in how quickly she processed each scan. Her fingers traced patterns on the films, identifying anomalies invisible to untrained eyes, translating shadow and light into diagnostic information that would determine treatment courses. A doctor entered the reading room, his body language demanding immediate attention despite Sable's obvious concentration. She set aside her current work without protest, pulling up different images on the computer screen to address his inquiry with patience that suggested this interruption was routine rather than exceptional. Through the observation window, Peyton watched the doctor's hand gesture toward specific area of the scan, his finger coming uncomfortably close to Sable's cheek as he pointed. She leaned away slightly, movement so subtle it would be invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it, but Peyton had spent career reading body language that communicated what words concealed. The doctor either didn't notice her discomfort or didn't care, continuing his explanation with oblivious entitlement. The radiology department's walls were decorated with educational posters showing skeletal system, proper positioning techniques, radiation safety protocols. One poster had begun peeling at corner, curling away from wall to reveal older advertisement beneath, archaeological layers of institutional history. The dated decor suggested budget constraints, equipment maintained through necessity rather than upgraded through surplus funding. A technician passed through the corridor carrying portable X-ray machine, its wheels squeaking with rhythm that marked her progress. She glanced at Peyton with curiosity but didn't slow, accustomed perhaps to family members keeping vigil in unusual locations. The hospital existed in constant state of controlled chaos, too much happening simultaneously for anyone to question one more person occupying liminal space. Sable's desk held personal touches that humanized the clinical workspace. Photograph of Emmett at younger age, his smile unguarded in way it no longer was, and small succulent plant that had somehow survived despite fluorescent lighting. Coffee mug bore message in faded letters, something about radiologists seeing through problems, workplace humor that probably provided minimal comfort during 16-hour shifts. The doctor leaned too close as he examined the screen, his hand resting on the back of her chair in gesture that blurred professional and personal boundaries. Sable's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but she maintained her explanation without acknowledging the invasion of space. Peyton's hands curled into fists inside his pockets, recognizing the power dynamic that played out in small violations disguised as collegiality. The doctor's behavior carried casual entitlement of someone who knew complaints would cost the complainant more than the offender. When the doctor finally left, Sable remained motionless for 3 full breaths before returning to her abandoned work. She pressed fingertips against her temples briefly, self-administered pressure point therapy for headache that probably hadn't left her in days. Peyton's phone vibrated with message from his contact. Colin Walsh's schedule tracked, pattern of behavior documented, vulnerabilities identified. The information arrived as cold data points, but Peyton translated them into narrative of man who drank himself into rage with predictable regularity, who had been fired from 2 jobs in past year for showing up intoxicated. The family room where Emmett waited was on the 2nd floor, Peyton discovered after consulting the directory. He took the stairs rather than elevator, needing the physical activity to channel energy that had nowhere productive to go. The room was empty except for Emmett, curled in corner chair with borrowed blanket, eyes tracking the doorway with alertness that should have been impossible given the hour. The boy straightened when he recognized Peyton, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something approaching satisfaction. "You came back," Emmett stated, no question in his tone, just confirmation of expectation that had apparently been met. He set aside the book he'd been holding, medical journal far too advanced for his age, probably taken from waiting room rack out of boredom rather than comprehension. Peyton crossed the room slowly, giving the boy time to reassess his earlier judgment, to recognize potential danger in inviting monsters into already complicated situations. But Emmett watched his approach with steady gaze that suggested fear had been conditioned out of him through repeated exposure to greater threats. "Your mom's working," Peyton said, the observation serving as explanation for his presence, though both of them understood it was inadequate justification. He lowered himself into chair adjacent to Emmett's, maintaining distance that respected the boy's autonomy while accepting implied invitation. Emmett nodded, pulling his blanket tighter around thin shoulders that bore too much responsibility. His feet still didn't reach the floor when he sat back, reminder of how young he actually was beneath the premature gravity. "She works a lot," Emmett offered, the statement carrying neither complaint nor pride, simply acceptance of reality that governed his existence. His eyes held question he hadn't yet formulated into words, assessment of whether Peyton could be trusted with information that might make things better or catastrophically worse. Peyton recognized the calculation happening behind those watchful eyes. the child's internal debate about risk versus potential reward. He'd conducted identical assessments countless times, though his stakes had involved criminal empires rather than domestic survival. The volunteer didn't show tonight, Emmett continued, filling silence with information that explained his solitude. She called in sick. Mom said I had to stay here anyway, that the nurses would check on me. The casual mention of negligence, adult responsibility outsourced to overworked staff who had actual patients requiring attention, settled like lead in Peyton's stomach. This was how children fell through cracks wide enough to swallow them whole, how preventable tragedies became inevitable through accumulated small failures. Emmett pulled something from his pocket, another drawing, this one more detailed than the first. The crayon figures had been replaced with careful pencil work, showing apartment building with specific number of windows, fire escape positioned on left side, door marked with red X. That's where we live, Emmett explained, offering the drawing with same deliberate trust he'd extended during their first encounter. The red X marked the third-floor corner unit, accessible by fire escape that violated multiple safety codes based on its obvious disrepair. Peyton accepted the drawing, studying details that revealed Emmett's observational skills extended beyond reading adult moods. The boy had documented sightlines, noted the broken security camera, even indicated which neighbors kept irregular hours. Uncle Colin doesn't like when people visit, Emmett added, his tone carefully neutral but his fingers worrying the blanket's edge with increased intensity. The statement hung between them, weighted with implications about what happened when unwanted attention arrived at that red-marked door. Peyton folded the drawing with same care he'd shown the first, recognizing it for what it was. Intelligence gathered by child soldier mapping his own battlefield. The gesture should have prompted questions about Emmett's safety, about mandatory reporting requirements, about proper channels for intervention. Instead, Peyton found himself asking, "Does he hurt you?" The directness violated every protocol about speaking with minors, but something in Emmett's demeanor suggested he'd respond better to plain language than careful social worker phrasing. Emmett's eyes dropped to his lap, small fingers stilling their anxious movement. The silence stretched long enough that Peyton began to regret the question, but then the boy spoke with voice barely above whisper. "He doesn't hit me," Emmett said, the careful parsing of his response more damning than outright admission. The distinction between physical violence directed at him versus witnessed violence was one no child should have learned to articulate. "But he hits your mom." Peyton kept his voice level, stating fact rather than asking confirmation, giving Emmett permission to acknowledge truth without feeling he'd betrayed family loyalty. The boy's nod was almost imperceptible, shame and relief warring across features too young to hold such complicated emotions. His hands gripped the blanket with white-knuckled intensity, physical manifestation of tension he couldn't otherwise express. "She says it's because he drinks," Emmett continued, reciting explanation that had probably been offered to him multiple times, justification that transformed violence into almost understandable consequence of chemical dependency. "She says he doesn't mean it." Peyton recognized the narrative, had heard variations of it from dozens of sources throughout his life. Intent became irrelevant when fists connected with flesh, when terror became daily reality, regardless of perpetrators' supposed remorse during sober intervals. "He broke plates last week," Emmett added, his voice gaining strength as details spilled out, dam breaking after holding back flood too long. "Mom cleaned it up before going to work. She cut her hand on the pieces." The image constructed itself in Peyton's mind with unwanted clarity. Sable on hands and knees gathering shards while her brother slept off his rage, preparing for shift at hospital, where she'd treat other people's injuries while ignoring her own. "Sometimes he takes her money," Emmett said, the revelation emerging with particular bitterness that suggested this violation carried weight beyond its financial impact. "She hides it now, but he finds it. He knows all her spots." Peyton's jaw tightened as the picture completed itself, the systematic control that extended beyond physical violence into economic abuse. Colin Walsh had engineered dependency, ensuring his sister couldn't accumulate resources necessary for escape. "Does your mom know you're telling me this?" Peyton asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Emmett's reconnaissance mission had been self-directed, child-taking initiative that adults around him had failed to provide. Emmett shook his head, fear finally crossing his features at prospect of maternal discovery. "She'd be mad. She says we don't tell people our business, that they wouldn't understand." The phrase carried echo of Colin's voice, Peyton suspected, the abuser's standard script about keeping family matters private. Isolation was weapon as effective as any physical force, cutting off potential support until victim believed she had no options beyond endurance. She's trying to save money, Emmett continued, urgency entering his tone as though he needed Peyton to understand the full context before passing judgment. For first and last month's rent somewhere else, but it's hard when he keeps taking it. The futility of Sable's strategy was obvious to adult analysis, but must have seemed like viable plan to woman trapped in circumstances that offered no good choices. Every dollar hidden and found represented hope deferred, timeline for escape extending further into uncertain future. Peyton spent the following day making calls that appeared unrelated to hospital encounters with determined child and his exhausted mother. He contacted property manager who owed him significant favor, inquired about vacant units in building far from Sable's current address, ensured certain financial arrangements could be made discreetly. The hardest part was engineering Colin Walsh's departure, without triggering the man's suspicion that his sister had orchestrated his removal. Peyton understood that abusers retaliated against perceived betrayal with escalated violence. That intervention required surgical precision to avoid making situation catastrophically worse. His contact in the oil industry owed him for previous assistance with union negotiations that had avoided costly strike. The debt was being called due now, translated into job offer that would arrive at Colin Walsh's doorstep, with timing that appeared coincidental rather than coordinated. Alaska pipeline work paid well enough to be tempting to man drowning in bar tabs and unemployment, isolated enough to prevent easy return if Walsh experienced change of heart. The contract stipulated immediate departure, signing bonus contingent on showing up at Anchorage processing facility within 72 hours. Peyton arranged for additional incentive in form of gambling debt that would suddenly come due, pressure from creditors timed to coincide with job offer's arrival. The combination of opportunity and threat would push Colin toward decision that served everyone's interests except his own desire to maintain control over his sister's life. The surveillance team reported Colin's patterns with depressing consistency. Drinking started at 3 each afternoon. Progression from beer to whiskey following trajectory that terminated in rage or unconsciousness, depending on variables too complex to predict. Sable's shifts aligned almost perfectly with Colin's dangerous hours, her absence from apartment protecting her, but leaving her son exposed to whatever residual violence needed outlet. Peyton discovered that Emmett stayed with elderly neighbor during most volatile periods, woman in her 70s who took the boy into her apartment with regularity that suggested informal arrangement born of necessity rather than friendship. The neighbor's statement to his investigator revealed she'd called police twice in past year, both times withdrawing complaints when Sable had begged her not to press charges against her brother. The system had failed comprehensively, Peyton recognized, not through single catastrophic oversight, but through accumulated small abandonments that collectively left vulnerable people without recourse. Mandatory reporting existed in theory, but foundered on reluctance to destroy families over situations that might improve, optimism bias that gambled children's safety against adults' potential for change. On the 4th night after his conversation with Emmett, Peyton returned to the hospital with purpose beyond observation. He carried envelope containing information Sable would need. Lease agreement for apartment that required no credit check. First 3 months paid by anonymous benefactor. Utilities arranged. Move-in possible immediately. He also carried burner phone programmed with single number she could call if Colin attempted contact after his departure, if the situation deteriorated beyond Peyton's careful planning. The phone represented crossing line he'd maintained throughout his career, personal involvement that contradicted every principle about keeping business and sentiment separate. Sable emerged from radiology at 3:17, precise timing that spoke to either coincidence or rhythm so regular it could be predicted. She startled when she saw Peyton waiting near the elevator bank, recognition and wariness competing across features drawn with exhaustion. "Mr. Navarro," she said, remembering his name from badge he'd deliberately left visible during their first encounter. Information gathering that had worked in both directions. Her hand moved instinctively to her throat, covering bruise that had darkened since he'd last seen her. "I need to speak with you," Peyton said, his tone leaving no room for polite refusal, but carefully avoiding threat that might trigger defensive flight response. He gestured toward empty consultation room whose door stood ajar, offering privacy without isolation that might feel dangerous. Sable hesitated, internal debate visible in how her weight shifted between feet, in how her eyes darted toward stairwell that represented escape route. But exhaustion won over caution, or perhaps curiosity about why dangerous man kept appearing in her life outweighed her sense of self-preservation. She preceded him into the room, maintaining distance that put furniture between them, positioning herself with back to wall rather than window. The defensive tactics were so ingrained she probably didn't recognize she was employing them. Survival instincts operating below conscious awareness. Peyton placed the envelope on table between them, not extending it directly in a way that might seem coercive. "Your son came to me because he recognized something he shouldn't have been able to identify," he began, choosing words carefully to acknowledge Emmett's precocity without criticizing Sable's parenting. Her face paled, fear and mortification warring for dominance as she realized what Emmett must have revealed. Her hands pressed flat against the wall behind her, preparing to push off if she needed to run. "He's scared," Peyton continued, keeping his voice level and his body language non-threatening, despite urgency he felt to convey how serious the situation had become. "Not of me. Of going home." Sable's eyes squeezed shut, single tear tracking down her cheek before she could prevent it. The crack in her armor revealed everything she normally kept, contained beneath professional competence and determined optimism that circumstances would somehow improve without intervention. "I can't," she started, but Peyton interrupted with gentle firmness that allowed no argument. "You can, and you will, because your son is counting steps and mapping exits and asking strangers for help, which means you're past the point where hoping things get better is viable strategy." 3 weeks passed before Peyton saw Emmett again, the boy appearing at the hospital's main entrance on Tuesday afternoon with backpack that looked almost new. The child's posture had changed subtly, shoulders no longer perpetually hunched in anticipation of blow that might come from any direction. Emmett spotted Peyton first, his face transforming with smile that belonged on 7-year-old features, uncomplicated joy that hadn't been present during their previous encounters. He ran forward with abandon that suggested he'd forgotten to check surroundings first, muscle memory of hypervigilance temporarily suspended. "We moved," Emmett announced breathlessly when he reached Peyton, words tumbling out with excited momentum that made him seem younger than his years. "Uncle Colin went to Alaska for work. Mom says he'll be gone a long time." Peyton crouched to Emmett's eye level, noting the absence of shadows beneath the boy's eyes, the way his hands hung relaxed at his sides instead of clenched into defensive fists. "How do you like the new place?" he asked, though he already knew the answer from surveillance reports that confirmed Sable and Emmett had settled into the apartment he'd arranged. "It has 2 bedrooms, Emmett said with reverence reserved for miracles, his emphasis on the number suggesting this was luxury beyond previous experience. "And the lock works on both doors. Mom tested them 5 times. The detail about locks communicated volumes about their previous living situation, about nights spent barricaded in single room hoping Colin's rage would exhaust itself before finding them. Peyton felt familiar anger tighten in his chest, controlled burn that he'd learned to channel into productive action rather than destructive impulse. "Mom wants to thank you," Emmett continued, his voice dropping to conspiratorial whisper, as though sharing classified information. "She figured out you helped. She tried to find out who paid for the apartment, but nobody would tell her." Peyton had ensured the paper trail led nowhere traceable, shell companies within shell companies obscuring his involvement with thoroughness that bordered on paranoid, not because he feared exposure, but because he understood Sable's pride would struggle with accepting charity from dangerous stranger. "She made extra food tonight," Emmett added, the invitation implicit in his statement, hope evident in how he watched Peyton's face for reaction. "She said if I saw you, I should invite you, if you want to come." The offer caught Peyton off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because it represented trust he hadn't realized he'd been seeking. Sable was opening door to her new sanctuary, allowing Monster Killer into space she'd fought so hard to make safe. "What time?" Peyton asked, making decision that probably contradicted every principle about maintaining distance from people whose lives he'd influenced. But Emmett's answering grin demolished any reservations, pure happiness that justified the boundary violation. 6 o'clock, Emmett said, then proceeded to give detailed directions that included landmarks, cross streets, and parking availability. Information delivered with precision that spoke to how thoroughly he'd studied their new neighborhood. "Building's blue. We're in 3B now. The B stands for better, Mom says." Peyton arrived at 5:57, punctuality that reflected his inability to be casually late for anything, especially invitations that felt more significant than simple dinner. The building was modest but well-maintained. Security system functional. Lobby clean in way that suggested management actually cared about tenant quality of life. Apartment 3B's door opened before he could knock, Emmett having apparently been watching through peephole for his arrival. The boy stepped back to allow entry, his excitement barely contained as he gestured toward small living room that held mismatched furniture, but radiated sense of safety, absent from previous dwelling. Sable emerged from kitchen wiping hands on towel, her expression complicated mixture of gratitude, embarrassment, and determination. She'd changed from scrubs into simple dress that suggested she'd considered this dinner significant enough to warrant effort beyond casual comfort. "Thank you for coming," she said, the formal politeness masking deeper emotion that showed in how her fingers worried the towel's edge. "And thank you for everything else. I know it was you, even though you covered your tracks well." Peyton nodded acknowledgement without offering explanation or denial, understanding that some gifts became poisoned by excessive examination. "You did the hard part," he said instead, redirecting credit in a way that honored her courage while accepting his role. The dinner was simple, but prepared with care that elevated modest ingredients into something that felt ceremonial. They ate at small table barely large enough for three, Emmett chattering about his new school with enthusiasm that filled silences adults might have found awkward. Sable watched her son with expression that carried relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. Mother seeing child recover innocence she'd feared was permanently lost. Her eyes met Peyton's across the table periodically, questions forming and dissolving unasked. After dinner, Emmett insisted on showing Peyton his room, the private space that represented security he'd never previously possessed. The walls were bare except for his drawings, taped up in careful arrangement that created gallery of his evolving artistic skill. The most recent drawing showed 3 figures, woman, child, and tall man with dark hair, standing in front of building marked with blue crayon. No monsters lurked in shadows. No red X marked the door. Above them, Emmett had written in increasingly steady letters, "Safe now." Peyton studied the image longer than necessary, using the moment to regain composure that had been unexpectedly compromised by child's artistic declaration. The inclusion of himself in Emmett's family portrait carried weight he hadn't anticipated, responsibility that felt both terrifying and strangely right. When they returned to living room, Sable had cleared the table and was pouring coffee with focused attention that suggested she was gathering courage for conversation she'd been rehearsing. She handed Peyton a cup, her fingers steady despite nervousness visible in how she avoided direct eye contact. "I'm going to pay you back," she said firmly, the statement allowing no argument despite obvious impossibility of her repaying what he'd spent on apartment and Colin's removal. "It might take years, but I'll pay every cent. I keep records, and I'm good with payment plans." Peyton set down his cup carefully, buying time to formulate response that would preserve her dignity, while making clear that debt repayment was not condition of his assistance. "Consider it investment in Emmett's future," he said finally. "The return I'm looking for isn't financial." The visits became routine over following weeks, pattern that established itself without formal agreement or discussion of terms. Peyton would arrive on Tuesday and Friday evenings, sometimes bringing takeout that spared Sable the cooking after her shift, other times simply appearing to fix whatever had broken since his last visit. The apartment revealed its age through persistent small failures: faucet that dripped, cabinet door that hung crooked, window that stuck halfway. Peyton discovered he possessed more domestic skills than he'd credited himself with, years of managing properties translating into practical knowledge he'd never had reason to exercise personally. Emmett shadowed him during these repairs, handing tools with solemnity of surgical assistant, asking questions that revealed both natural curiosity and desire to learn self-sufficiency. The boy absorbed information like he was building manual for future independence, noting which direction to turn screws and how to identify when seal needed replacing. Sable watched these interactions from kitchen or doorway, her expression cycling through emotions Peyton couldn't fully interpret. Sometimes gratitude, sometimes apprehension, frequently something that looked like wonder at witnessing her son experience mentorship without underlying threat or ulterior demand. On the 4th Tuesday, Peyton arrived to find Emmett struggling with math homework, frustration evident in how aggressively he erased wrong answers. Sable was sleeping after double shift, her exhaustion finally overwhelming her tendency to push through fatigue, and Emmett had apparently decided not to wake her. Peyton settled beside the boy, examining the problems with attention he normally reserved for contract negotiations and territorial disputes. Mathematics operated on principles he understood: fixed rules, logical progression, definitive answers, unlike human behavior, which resisted such comfortable predictability. They worked through equations together, Peyton's explanations stripped of academic jargon, focusing instead on practical applications that made abstract concepts concrete. Emmett's face brightened with each problem solved, confidence growing as patterns became visible beneath initially confusing numbers. When Sable emerged an hour later, hair disheveled from sleep and apology already forming on her lips, she found them bent over worksheet together. Emmett was explaining his solution process to Peyton, teaching back what he'd learned, and Peyton was listening with full attention as though the boy was presenting critical intelligence rather than elementary mathematics. "He's good at this," Peyton said to Sable, his praise casual but genuine, acknowledging capability rather than offering empty encouragement. Patient enough to work through problems methodically instead of guessing and hoping. Emmett glowed under the assessment, sitting straighter with pride that transformed his entire bearing. Sable's eyes welled with tears. She blinked back quickly, overwhelmed by a scene that should have been ordinary, but felt miraculous given their history. "I should pay you for tutoring too," she said, attempting lightness that didn't quite mask emotional intensity beneath the joke. Her hand rested on Emmett's shoulder, connection that grounded both of them. The dynamic between Peyton and Sable was shifting, he recognized, moving from gratitude-based formality towards something resembling actual friendship. She'd stopped treating him like dangerous benefactor, who might revoke assistance if displeased, began responding to his presence with welcome that felt genuine rather than obligatory. She started leaving apartment door unlocked on evenings when she expected him, trust so profound it made Peyton's chest constrict. In neighborhood where security meant everything, where she'd obsessively checked locks in previous dwelling, her willingness to leave entry unsecured for his arrival communicated more than words could contain. They developed unspoken protocols. Peyton texted before coming, giving her option to decline if she needed privacy or rest. She always responded affirmatively, her messages brief but warm, often including what Emmett had done that day worth sharing. One Friday, Peyton arrived to find Sable attempting to assemble bookshelf she'd purchased at thrift store, instruction manual spread across floor, pieces arrayed in chaos that suggested previous assembly attempt had failed spectacularly. Emmett sat nearby, offering encouragement that wasn't particularly helpful, but demonstrated his faith in maternal capability. "Don't say anything," Sable warned when she saw Peyton's expression, pointing screwdriver at him with mock threat. "I'm perfectly capable of putting together furniture. I just need to figure out why they included extra pieces that don't match the diagram." Peyton examined the scattered components, identifying the problem within seconds. She'd been following instructions for different model, previous owner having mixed manuals when donating the piece. He didn't point this out directly, instead suggesting they start over with fresh approach, methodology that allowed her to discover the error herself. They worked together while Emmett supervised, the boy providing commentary that ranged from helpful observations to creative suggestions that would have resulted in structurally unsound furniture. Sable's laughter came easily, tension that normally tightened her shoulders absent in an environment where mistakes carried no consequences beyond minor frustration. When the bookshelf finally stood complete and stable, Emmett immediately began arranging his books on its shelves with organizational system that made sense only to him. Sable collapsed onto couch with theatrical exhaustion, gesturing for Peyton to join her in observing their handiwork. "I couldn't have done this before," she said quietly, her meaning extending beyond bookshelf to encompass larger transformation of their circumstances. "Any of it. I was so tired I couldn't think past the next shift, the next rent payment, the next time Colin would—" She didn't finish the sentence, but she didn't need to. Peyton understood the exhaustion that accumulated through constant crisis management, the way survival mode precluded planning beyond immediate threats. "You're doing it now," he said simply, redirecting her focus from past impossibility to present reality. "That's what matters." Emmett looked up from his books, studying both adults with expression that carried satisfaction beyond his years. "You should stay for movie night," he announced with authority that assumed agreement rather than requesting permission. "Mom always falls asleep during the movie anyway, so you have to help me watch the end." The movie nights became tradition, Friday evening ritual that anchored Peyton's week in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself scheduling business around these commitments, ensuring he'd be available when Emmett expected him, unwilling to disappoint child who'd already experienced too much adult unreliability. True to Emmett's prediction, Sable rarely made it through entire film, exhaustion claiming her somewhere around midpoint. She'd curl into corner of couch, fighting sleep for 20 minutes before finally surrendering, her breathing evening into peaceful rhythm that spoke to sense of security she'd achieved. The first time it happened, Peyton had sat rigidly uncertain of protocol, hyper-aware of her vulnerable proximity. But Emmett had simply adjusted blanket over his mother's sleeping form with practiced care then resumed watching movie as though nothing unusual had occurred. Now, weeks into this pattern, Peyton had learned to relax into these evenings, Emmett's running commentary on film providing cover for thoughts that wandered toward dangerous territory. Dangerous because they involved imagining this as permanent arrangement rather than temporary intervention, because he'd begun thinking in terms of we, instead of maintaining careful distance. On a Tuesday evening in early November, Peyton arrived to find Emmett unusually subdued, his typical enthusiasm replaced with something approaching anxiety. Sable was still at work, her shift running late according to text she'd sent, asking if Peyton could stay with Emmett until she returned. "Mom got a letter," Emmett said, after letting Peyton in, his voice carrying worry that aged him back into child who'd learned to anticipate disaster. "From Uncle Colin. He wants to come back." Peyton's entire body went still, predatory focus that had served him in countless dangerous situations, now directed toward threat against people he'd inadvertently claimed as his to protect. "When did this letter arrive?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral despite rage building beneath carefully maintained surface. "Yesterday," Emmett replied, watching Peyton's face with intensity that suggested he was gauging whether adult reaction would match his own fear. "Mom didn't tell me what it said. She just got real quiet and then burned it in the sink." The image of Sable destroying evidence of her brother's communication spoke volumes about her response, defiance mixed with terror that Colin's return would undo everything they'd built. Peyton's mind was already working through logistics, contingencies, ways to ensure Colin Walsh remained in Alaska permanently rather than temporarily. Peyton's contacts in Alaska had already been activated, surveillance team monitoring Colin's movements and communications with efficiency that would disturb anyone who understood how thoroughly one person could be watched. The reports arrived daily. Colin's drinking had intensified in isolation, his performance at work deteriorating to point where contract termination was becoming an attractive option to his employers. The man was self-destructing on schedule, rage and alcohol consuming him from inside. The darkest part of him, the part Emmett had accurately identified, almost wanted Colin to try returning, wanted excuse to demonstrate exactly what happened to men who terrorized women and children under his protection. But the better part, the part that was learning to exist through knowing Sable and Emmett, recognized that violence would traumatize them regardless of whether it was exercised in their defense. The cleanest solution was one they never witnessed: protection operating in shadows, where it couldn't cast darkness over their carefully constructed light. "Your uncle signed a contract," Peyton said carefully, offering reassurance without making promises he might not be able to keep. "He can't just leave whenever he wants. There are penalties, financial and otherwise." Emmett nodded but didn't look convinced, his experience having taught him that rules often failed to protect vulnerable people from those willing to break them. "What if he comes anyway?" the boy asked, fear finally cracking through his attempted bravery. Peyton crouched to Emmett's level, placing hands on the boy's shoulders with grip that was firm but gentle, grounding. "Then I'll handle it," he said, the statement carrying weight of promise that extended beyond simple reassurance into vow. "He won't hurt either of you again. I guarantee it." The certainty in his tone seemed to penetrate Emmett's anxiety, the boy's shoulders relaxing incrementally as he processed adult commitment that felt trustworthy, because it came without qualifications or conditions. "Because you kill monsters," Emmett said, not quite question but seeking confirmation of earlier assessment. "Because I protect the people who matter," Peyton corrected gently, reframing the narrative in a way that acknowledged his capability for violence while redirecting its purpose toward something constructive. "And you matter. Both of you." When Sable arrived home 40 minutes later, she found them in living room, Emmett doing homework, while Peyton prepared dinner using ingredients she'd had in refrigerator. The domestic scene should have felt jarring given who Peyton was, what he did, but instead it felt natural in a way that terrified and comforted him simultaneously. Sable's eyes went immediately to Emmett, checking for signs of distress, and Peyton realized the boy must have told her about Colin's letter. Her gaze shifted to Peyton, question and plea combined in expression that asked without words if he knew, if he could do anything, if safety they'd found was about to be ripped away. "We need to talk," Peyton said quietly, nodding toward kitchen in suggestion of privacy. Sable hesitated, glancing at Emmett, but the boy was already absorbed in his homework with focus that suggested he was deliberately creating space for adult conversation. In the kitchen, Sable leaned against counter with exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue, the kind of weariness that came from thinking you'd escaped only to discover your cage had merely expanded slightly. "He's coming back," she said flatly. No question, just defeated certainty. "No," Peyton replied with conviction that made her head snap up, hope and disbelief warring across her features. "He's not. His contract includes clause about early termination. If he breaks it, he'll face financial penalties he can't afford and potential legal action for breach." Sable's laugh was bitter, sharp-edged with experience that had taught her that legal consequences rarely deterred men like her brother. "You don't know Colin. He doesn't care about contracts or consequences. He'll come back because he can't stand that I got away, that I'm making it without him. Then I'll ensure he understands that coming back would be very, very bad idea," Peyton said, his tone shifting into register he normally reserved for business negotiations where failure to comply resulted in permanent solutions. "I have resources he can't imagine, connections that extend further than his limited worldview conceives. If he attempts to return, he'll discover exactly how unpleasant life can become for people who threaten things I've decided to protect." The possessiveness in his phrasing should have alarmed her, Peyton realized, but instead Sable's eyes filled with tears that tracked down her cheeks unchecked. She crossed the small kitchen distance between them, and before Peyton could process her intention, she'd wrapped her arms around him in an embrace that communicated gratitude and relief, and something deeper neither of them was ready to name. Peyton froze for heartbeat, his body uncertain how to respond to genuine affection offered without agenda or manipulation. Then his arms came up slowly, encircling her with careful gentleness, holding her while she shook with silent tears against his chest. "Why are you doing this?" she asked when she finally pulled back, though she didn't move far, her hands still resting against his arms. "You don't owe us anything. We're nothing to you. Just random people you met in a hospital." Peyton looked toward living room where Emmett was visible through doorway, the boy's head bent over his homework, crayon moving with determined strokes across paper. "You're not random," he said finally, returning his attention to Sable. "And you're not nothing. Emmett saw something in me that he needed, someone who could fight the monsters he couldn't. And I saw something in him that I needed. Reason to be the person who fights for someone other than himself." Understanding dawned across Sable's features, recognition that this had become important to him in ways he probably hadn't fully acknowledged to himself. "You're not a monster," she said softly, her hand moving to touch his face with tenderness that made something crack in his chest. "You're the person who showed up when no one else did. That's not a monster. That's just someone who's been hurt enough to recognize hurt in others." The kiss happened without conscious decision from either of them, natural progression of proximity and emotion that had been building beneath the surface of their careful friendship. It was brief, tentative, question asking permission, more than statement declaring intent. When they separated, Emmett was standing in the doorway, his expression cycling through surprise and satisfaction, before settling on smile that suggested he'd been expecting this development. "Does this mean Peyton stays forever now?" he asked with 7-year-old directness that cut through adult complexity. Sable laughed through tears, looking at Peyton for answer she wasn't ready to demand. Peyton met Emmett's eyes, seeing the hope there, the fear of disappointment, the desperate wish for permanence in a world that had taught him nothing lasted. "As long as you'll have me," Peyton said, the promise encompassing both of them, commitment that terrified him less than the alternative of walking away from people who'd somehow become essential to his existence. "I'm not going anywhere." Emmett ran forward, launching himself at Peyton with faith that he'd be caught, and Peyton lifted the boy automatically, feeling Sable's hand slip into his free one. They stood there in kitchen doorway, improbable family formed from trauma and intervention and choice to protect instead of destroy, and Peyton recognized that the monster inside him had finally found purpose worth serving. Thank you all for following this story. If you've enjoyed it, write in the comments from what place you're watching this story, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing you these stories. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is ask for help, just like Emmett did. Remember that there are people who will fight your monsters if you let them.